Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks all. Welcome along to this evening's Institute of Historical Research, Transport and Mobility History seminar. It's lovely to see so many of you here. We'll go through a few introductions, housekeeping bits before we get started, and then we will hand over to our speakers for this evening. If I could ask everyone to keep themselves muted during the presentation aspect of it. There will be a chance to ask questions and so on at the end, and you're welcome to make use of the chat facility, but it's helpful for the speakers and for us all if everyone is muted throughout. Before we get started on this evening's topic, I want to look forward to actually the next two sessions that we will have coming up in the Transport and Mobility History series. The first of those is it's a hybrid event. It's taking place on the 9th of May for those attending in person, at Aston University. It's a early career and PhD student networking session. It's open to everyone to attend, but the focus and the presentations that we're here are going to have 5 10-minute presentations coming from some PhD students, again with the opportunity to ask questions afterwards and the chance to find out what people are doing and to network. So if you can attend in person, it would be lovely to see you. If you need to attend online, again, you're very welcome. It'd be lovely to see you there. And Lewis, who is doing the tech this evening, sorry, I forgot to introduce Lewis, another one of the co-conveners of the series. Lewis has popped the link to that session in the chat, so you can register for that. The second session to plug is a more, well, I was going to say it's a more traditional seminar. It's not. It's a slightly different format, again, but it is an online session on the 23rd of May, Everyday Post-War Mobilities, Social, Cultural, Environmental Histories of Everyday Travel in the Post-War Period. We've got one person named on that at the moment, Elsa Devine, but there will be a number of colleagues who are working with her on broad topics about everyday mobility in the post-war period. So that one's going to be a bit more of a kind of short discursive conversations from each of the speakers, and then a chance for Q&A and discussion afterwards. So do please join us for that. However, that's the future. Let's return to the present. And I am delighted to welcome along 2 speakers this evening, Rachel MacGregor and Neil Carter. This evening's session is somewhat misleadingly entitled Ask the Archivist, because we have one archivist, Rachel, with us, and we have an academic, Neil, with us as well. Now, the two of them know each other and work closely together in all sorts of ways, because the archive that is at the centre of this evening's discussion is the thing that's brought them together. So this is the National Cycling Archive, which is held at the Modern Record Centre at the University of Warwick. And that is where Rachel is based. So, as I say, she's an archivist based at the MRC. I can say, again, from knowing Rachel and from using the MRC, it's a fantastic archive, loads of brilliant records. I've used them for all sorts of other different things, but the transport mobility collections are very broad and varied. Also, their trade union connections, which is one reason why I've used them in particular. So, the fantastic resource, and the archivists and the team there are brilliant. So I can't sing their praises enough. So I'm really pleased that we could do this session this evening, that Rachel was able to come along and join us for that. And likewise, so Rachel will be going first in terms of presenters. Neil will go second. So Neil is a senior lecturer in history at Montfort University, with particular interest in sports and leisure history. He's a senior research fellow at the International Centre for Sports History and Culture, and has relatively recently, published History of Cycling in Britain with Bloomsbury. I think that's a couple of years ago now. So he's done extensive work on cycling, and including, of course, making use of the National Cycling Archive at the MRC. And with no further ado, please then can I hand over to Rachel.
Thank you, Mike. That was a lovely introduction. Right, I'm just going to share my screen. That's working okay, is it? And I'll just pop it into the correct mode. Go on, you know you want to. Right, is that all looking okay?
Perfect. Looks good here.
Right, okay, let's just have to just sort of get it so that I can read my notes. I can't talk without my notes, so I will try and keep to time. Important in these things. I'll have that sort of going in the background. So, yes, my name's Rachel MacGregor, and I'm one of the team at the Modern Records Centre, which is it's the Archives and Special Collections at the University of Warwick. And you may be able to spot my backdrop, which emphasises the point that we were founded just over 50 years ago in 1973. So we had some celebrations around that, which created my nice backdrop. The collections, so we collect on a wide range of topics. I'd describe this as a medium-sized archive if you're looking at the UK sort of landscape. We have about 16 kilometres of shelving, if you can imagine that, and probably about 1,500 separate collections. So thinking of that as separate sort of things, all different sizes, obviously. Right, come on, move on. We did try this, didn't we? Oh, there we go. Yes, sometimes needs a bit of persuading to move on the slides. So I just thought before I start talking about the National Cycle Archive, I just thought I'd kind of set the scene a bit about what the Modern Records Centre is about. So Neil, Mike's already referred to the fact that we hold trades union records. So we were set up really to study kind of the history of labour and employment and employer-employee relations. So on that basis, we're the National Centre for Collecting Trades Union Records. We hold the records of the Trades Union Congress, the International Transport Workers Federation, which is actually one of my favourite archives there. Absolutely fascinating stuff in it. You'll have to invite me back for a second talk on that. We've got the records of ASLEF, who are, in the headlines quite a bit at the moment, and also the constituent unions that now formed RMT, so NUR and NUS, Transport and General Workers Union. So I was obviously mentioning a lot of transport-related union records we have. Most recently, however, we've taken in the records of the National Union of Mine Workers, a big project that we're running at the moment around that, a very distinguished collection. But on the other side of the sort of employee-employer thing, we also collect around the sort of employment and employers' organisations and trades associations. We have the records of the Confederation of British Industry, CBI, and then countless trade organisations. And I just kind of picked a few sort of random ones, really, that were related to transport, like the International Shipping Federation, the Chamber of Shipping, Association of Master Lightermen and Barge Owners, Motorcycle Association, so on and so forth. Lots and lots of those. We also collect records relating to particularly radical non-mainstream political parties, so particularly Marxist and Trotskyist political organisations, but some material relating to the extreme right as well. We have records of pressure groups, notably CND, the Howard League for Penal Reform, the Electoral Reform Society, and just to prove the point that it's not purely political pressure groups we collect from, it is any pressure group. We recently took records of the Campaign for Real Ale in, so we're quite pleased with those. We have a number of personal papers as well, usually with a link to the things we already collect. So we have records of a lot of trades unionists, Ron Todd, Rodney Bickerstaff, Bill Morris, Ernest Bevan. We also hold the papers of the historian Eric Hobsbawm. Now, originally, so why do we have the National Cycle Archive? Well, originally, transport was also part of our sort of official collecting policy. And I think that was because of the very strong links between Coventry, which is where we are, and the automotive and obviously earlier cycling industries. But a lot of records, particularly around the industries that kind of built and made bicycles and then later cars and everything else, you know, there are other places to go to find the sort of industrial records. So, for example, the British Motor Museum near us at Gaydon, or, for example, if you wanted the records of Raleigh, you'd find those at Nottinghamshire Archives. So the National Cycle Archive, which I'll come to now, that sort of sits on its own. So the National Cycle Archive was established in 1990 by the Cyclist Touring Club, following a bequest. And so we don't own it. It's administered by the trustees of the Cycling History and Educational Trust. But so it collects records around the history of cycling, and so we house those records and make them available, basically. It's a vast archive, and there's a wealth of information there about the development of cycling, both for sport and leisure, from the 19th century onwards. And I think both Neil and I struggled a bit with this because there's so much that we could be talking about. It was quite difficult to kind of draw it together because it's so big and disparate. It contains over 7,000 items, mostly dating from the 1880s onwards. The oldest item in the collection dates from 1675. It's a copy of John Ogilvy's Britannia, which is one of the first surveys of the road, one of the first road atlases of Britain, attempted a proper survey of the roads at the time. So obviously it quite predates the development of the bicycle, which is probably a good job, as I imagine the roads weren't that great in the 17th century. But anyway, but the vast majority of the collection is from the 19th century onwards, with the emergence of the bicycle as we know it today. The collection's organised into material relating to individual cyclists, cycling associations, clubs and cycling companies, and then collections arranged by format, so photographs or journals in particular, and things like that. We do obviously hold other records relating to cycling, the records of the Cyclist Touring Club, later Cycling UK, and the National Cycle Museums Trust. So it's obvious that this is a great source if you're interested in the history of cycling, or if you're a cycling historian, or if you're just an enthusiast and you're just interested in the topic. It's a brilliant place to come and kind of look through what there is. But it's also an unparalleled resource for social history more broadly, really rich holdings relating to all aspects of 19th, 20th and 21st century life. So in terms of what kinds of things in there, well, it covers the cycle industry and clubs, racing in the professional sport, but also cycling as a leisure activity, diaries, books, talks and lectures, and random sort of oddities, which I'll come to a bit later. So you can expect to find format-wise, you know, photos and diaries and press cuttings and maps and scrapbooks and collections from clubs and all sorts of things. So I'll try and give you a flavour of some of those, but as I say, very difficult to fit into the time we had available. So this first slide that I've got here, you can see is one of the cycling diaries, which is one of the richest sources in the collections. They often include drawings, watercolours, photographs, and largely UK and Europe, I would say, with the coverage of where these very disparate diaries are covered. Some of them have been digitised and are available through the website, and we'll share at the end of the talk some of the links, so I'll share a link to where you can find those. The cycling diary here is part of a 20-day cycle tour undertaken by Walter Dodds, who went on a tour of the north of France in the summer of 1914, or some point in 1914, before the war had broken out. And it's quite a moving diary, really, because he's recording the country as he finds it before the war breaks out, and then kind of writes it up, reflecting a little bit on what has been destroyed in terms of where he was travelling through. This is, we've got two illustrated diaries by a gentleman called Joseph Hall, who you can see here. He toured the east of England in 1898 and 1899, and you can see just how much care and attention is lavished on these productions, many of them. So they're lovely in terms of being a work of art or something like that, but also really interesting, giving sort of itineraries of where he's been and descriptions. And again, as I say, you can explore many of these online. This is another one of a cycling tour of Cork and Kerry in 1935 by a guy called Fred Caffin. And, you know, includes some lovely photographs. So we get a little, as well as sort of the sense of the places they're traveling through, a little peer into the past that we get captured in these photographs. Although I have to say that Carrickadroid Castle, which you can see here, I haven't been, I'd love to, but it looks pretty much the same as that now. So it's a glimpse into the past, but looks very similar. But it's nice to be able to kind of see what's changed and what hasn't. We have 7 editions of the Canonby Cycling Club Chronicle, which was edited by Arthur C. Armstrong, who was a cycling journalist. And it's kind of a pretend sort of cycling club, written by members of the club. So it had a few different contributors, and it's all sort of handwritten and in a kind of comic style. So it's very much like Three Men in a Boat. It's got that sort of comedy kind of feel to it, but it's got some absolutely lovely photographs and sketches and hand-drawn maps and things like that in it. That's a really lovely thing. This is a diary belonging to a woman called Amy Maldon, who travelled in Switzerland as well as around the UK in the sort of late 19th century. And this is particularly nice because she collected botanical specimens while she travelled. So you've got these preserved. They're very, very fragile, but we've had them digitised and they're sort of preserved, and you can see those really lovely thing. This diary here belonged to a guy called Tom Flynn. So he was from Plaistow, and he kept a diary between 1932 and 1952. And I think drawing attention to this one, it doesn't look as pretty as some of the others, but they're amongst the most detailed because he also talks about lots of other aspects of his life. He does talk about cycling, and that's kind of the core of it. But he talks about kind of his leisure activities, so going to the cinema, the theatre, what he listened to on the radio. Talks about the adult education classes he attended in the evening. And it covers the Second World War when he was a fire watcher for his street. So it kind of gives a load of detail about that. So obviously there's lots of social history to be had from many of these diaries, not just around cycling. And again, these you can all see online via our web pages. So there's also a huge amount of photographic material as well as the diaries. And so I've just picked on a couple here, a couple of people to mention, both of whom took a lot of photographs and created lantern slides, which they used for lectures that they would tour. So on the left here, we have William Fitzwater Ray, who was a journalist, writer, a cyclist, but hugely popular in the early part of the 20th century. He wrote under the pen name Kuklos, which means circle or ring in Greek. And on the right, that is Mrs. Parks. She wrote under the pseudonym Petronella, and both she had a regular column in the CTC Gazette. Both of them travelled across Europe and took lots of photographs. And then, so this is a selection, and again, you can look through them in detail on our website. These belong to William Fitzwater Ray, and lots of detail. He'd go around giving lectures, and you could, obviously people were looking at the lantern slides, promoting cycling as well as an activity. Petronella, who also travelled extensively and wrote as well, wrote a column, as I mentioned. It's worth noting that I don't know what her first name was, and reflecting on the fact there's a lot more information out there about William Fitzwater Ray than Mrs. Parks. I'm not sure. Neil and I both decided not to go down the rabbit hole of trying to find out what her first name was before the talk. But if anyone wants to, it would be really nice to have someone do a bit more work on her, because she's a really interesting figure, and sadly, does come across as being a bit more overlooked than her sort of William Fitzwater Ray is writing at a similar time and undertaking similar activities. Talking about women and cycling, that's obviously a big topic within the archive, and that there's lots of interesting material for relating to cycling, not just cycling, but to kind of women's position in society. And again, with the links, we've got lots of resources digitized so that you can explore that a bit more. Women taking to the roads on bikes, it gave them a certain amount of autonomy and freedom. The clothing that they wore had to be adapted because riding a bike in a corset and a long skirt is not that easy. So as you see, for the group of women on the left, they're wearing kind of quite short skirts. And then on the right, in this satirical postcard, the woman is wearing pantaloons. So she is a new woman. So she is a woman who rides a bike. She is probably campaigning for women's rights and a feminist. And here we see her ordering her husband to have dinner on the table and leaving her children sort of to, get on with it, be left to the mercy of their husband's care. And there he is doing the washing and everything. So there's some really interesting stuff about the perceptions of, women and cycling in the archive. We've also got here, I just picked on a couple of early women professional cyclists. So Mademoiselle Lisette, who was, her actual name was Amélie Le Gaulle, and Mrs. Grace, she's captioned, she was Clara Simmons Grace. Both racing sort of late 19th century, kind of competed against one another. Amélie Le Gaulle in particular, definitely, she never wore a skirt to cycling, and you can see both of them are wearing, I think both wearing kind of +4s, sort of shorts to cycle in, and they're obviously both wearing, both riding bikes with crossbars. So you can really see this, the dress thing demonstrated by these professional cyclists and women who are showing that women can become athletes and can excel in these spheres. I felt I had to share this. This is a great article about self-defense. This is only just a little snippet from it. Self-defense whilst cycling. Now, harassment of both men and women whilst cycling is unfortunately not something that has gone away, and it's something that's obviously been around as long as the bicycle. This particular article in unfortunately, forgotten which journal it is, it's going to has some suggestions as to how you might tackle on-road harassment. So the woman has got her water pistol out, and the man is using his bicycle pump, in fact, as a weapon. There's some other more alarming suggestions of using the entire bike as a weapon, and also some suggestions for women to sort of how to cycle to kind of avoid having people put sticks in your spokes and all this kind of stuff. So it's sort of, I think, find it possibly a bit amusing, but actually it's not really, the topic is obviously not that amusing, and it was a real issue for men and women in particular, perhaps, getting that level of harassment while cycling. And I thought it was probably also worth just saying a word about diversity, or perhaps the lack of it in cycling. So cycling was an extremely popular activity for men and women, and across the social divides. We see cyclists from lots of different backgrounds coming through, particularly in the professional circles. But I think there's a lot more work to be done highlighting stories of cyclists, for example, black cyclists and cyclists from more diverse backgrounds. I sort of had a word with colleagues and asked to see if anyone had come across material from the cycling archive that related to any black cyclists or whatever, and someone sort of pointed me to a mention for Major Taylor, who was an American cyclist of the sort of 19th, 20th, early 10th to 20th century, who was a big figure when he was cycling, but then died in relative poverty in 1932. But since then, he sort of now sort of recognised, long after his death, and in fact, a velodrome in his hometown of Indianapolis was named for him. So it's the Major Taylor Velodrome, which got a photo of there. But there's definitely a lot more that needs to be done in this area. I didn't feel I had much to bring on this topic. So that's something that we'd love to see people try and use the archives more for. And then finally, I did mention when I started out that there were other things, not just kind of diaries and photographs. This is a board game, and we've got all sorts of kind of quirky things in the archive, which all probably speak to the social history of cycling. This is nice, from around 1900, and originally came with, because I've seen the V&A have a copy of this, originally came with little lead figures that you move around the board. I think they've obviously gone missing, sadly, the little lead by, cyclists. So you work your way around the board, and you end up at the Anchor at Ripley, which was a really well-known pub as a sort of place to cycle to from London. It's just out near Guildford, on the A3. It's still there. It's now a Michelin-starred restaurant, so I don't know whether it's welcoming cyclists in quite the same way, but maybe it is. I'd be interested if anyone knows it. And I think that more or less, hopefully, has given you a bit of an insight into what we've got. I feel I've just sort of, skipped along it, but I'd like to now hand over to Neil, who is sort of come at it from the other side of the archive desk as a researcher, and so can obviously give his view on the archive as a researcher.
Yeah, many thanks, Rachel. I'm just going to talk about my book, which was published in 2021. Took about 8-9 years to research and write, and the vast bulk of that research, 80-90% of it was done at the MRC using the National Cycle Archive, which, in my experience, it's the most extensive yet underutilized sports archive I've come across. So my first experience with the archive was back in 2002. I was doing a bit of work on for someone else on Tommy Simpson. You probably know who was the British cyclist who died on Montfort too. I've done this, but ultimately nothing came of it. But it kind of made me aware of the extent of the archive, and later I came back to it to write this book. So just to say a few things about the book. So it examines the history of cycling from the 19th century through to the 21st. The structure of it's loosely chronological, with each chapter based on a particular theme, such as class, popular culture, Englishness, gender, the impact of car, motoring, consumption, and also environmentalism. So one of the main ideas behind the book is that riding a bicycle has been a political act in all its forms, whether that be sport, leisure, or a form of transport. And what it kind of showed was that there was a lot of overlap between particularly these three areas. So even when it came to sport, a lot of that was related to the politics of cycling. Another distinctive aspect of the book is, in comparison to other European nations, Britain developed its own cycling culture, and it was subject to a broader context, which I go on to kind of outline. And like I said, it's largely a product of the MRC. Now, in terms of the research project, what I used as kind of Rachel in some ways as outlined. I mean, a lot of the material I saw in Rachel's presentation, I never looked at. It kind of indicates that the vastness to a certain extent of the archive, and my research just touched the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I consulted 25 collections, the mixture of club archives, personal collections, institutional archive, journals, publications, and also political bodies. Now, if you just look a bit closely at the archives that I consulted, if you look at the top one, you can see I used the British Cycle and Motorcycle Manufacturers and Trade Union Limited archives, which were very useful in for my research, but they weren't part of the actual National Cycle Archive. So there was other material that I could use in the MRC. So my initial aims when I started were quite vague, because, as kind of Rachel said, the archive is quite disparate, fragmentary. This is one of its strengths and attractions, but it can be problematic. So I spent a few weeks just glancing through the archive, and then I decided to look in more detail at the Derek Roberts collection. I wanted to get a kind of general grasp of the subject and its history. Now, who was Derek Roberts? Well, he was someone who was incredibly knowledgeable about the history of cycling. He was an amateur historian, and he collected masses of material on all aspects of cycling. And he was one of the people who got the National Cycle Archive to Warwick. He was one of the people behind it. In many ways, he was devoted to the past cycling, its glory days. So, for example, he was a founder of the Fellowship of Cycling Old-Timers. But still, as you can see, he collected a lot of stuff. So I didn't look at his entire collection, which contains just the 166 folders. And this, as you can see, this took a lot of, as you can imagine, it took months to look through. So the archive includes 124 subfolders regarding cycling organisations and 279 publications. And there's a whole number of themes running through that particular archive, you know, industry, individuals, and technology. Technology was one of the main themes. So one of the how the bicycle developed as a piece of technology. So, for example, you've got image on the left here of a Draisian, which was said to argue that this was a forerunner of the modern bicycle. On the right here, we have a what's known as a sociable, which men and which couples could use, married couples, courting couples. There's an interesting aspect of gender relations. It was usually the man who was doing all the work, all the peddling. In many ways, I kind of there's a big debate among cycling historians about, you know, as I've alluded to, about what was the first bicycle. I kind of, in the book, kept my distance from that. I mean, because my focus was more on who rode the bicycles. And these debates can be a bit, you can go down a rabbit hole with them, so I kind of kept my distance. But saying that, in many ways, the 19th century has been the most exciting period for cycling historians because of these technical developments. These are more images of the early days. So in the image on the left is a musical act called Albin, and he performed certain tricks on this oversized ordinary or penny farthing, as kind of commonly known. And on the right there, there's a race of penny farthings, ordinaries, taking place at Herne Hill. So it shows how the ubiquity of the bicycle. So by the mid to late 1800s, the ordinary was taken over, surpassed by the safety bicycle here on the left here. The first model, the Rover, you could argue it's probably the most important bicycle ever built in Coventry. And what it did was it democratized cycling, and in particular made it easier for women to ride bikes. The bicycle in many ways became an agent of emancipation for women, particularly, although you argue middle-class women. And it ushered in the first cycling boom of the 1890s. Not only were the middle classes now riding bicycles, men and women, but there was also the working classes were able to afford bicycles. There was a thriving second-hand market as well, so that really helped in that democratization. And now, as we know, archives are never neutral. And in the Roberts collection, there was generally an uncritical view of some of the cycling pioneers. So on the left, we have G. Lacey Hillier, who was a champion amateur cyclist in its early days. As you can see, this picture's from 1879. But he was also a kind of arch amateur, a real somebody wanted to hold up the values of amateurism in cycling and in society more generally. He was also, as many amateurs were, he was also hypocritical regarding amateurism. On the right, we have F.S. Bidlake, arguably the most important cycling figure in the first 50 years, but who again, he represented the values of the Victorian era, and when cycling was quite a relatively niche activity for the middle classes, and by the time of his death in the 1930s, it became a mass activity. Now, away from the Roberts collection, the NCA has records of cycling clubs, which were at the centre of the British cycling culture. And there's a number of archives of clubs from the Victorian period up to the late 20th century. Initially, clubs were consisted of members of the upper middle classes, particularly the North Road Club. I think on the left here we have the London Bicycle Club, which was a premier club of the period. By the interwar years, so there was a much greater number of working class clubs. And it wasn't just clubs. There was also the cyclist touring club. It's an interesting development in the sense that it was a very much a middle class body initially, and then by the interwar years, working class cyclists joined it. They formed the kind of a lot of them formed district associations, and they undertook their own cycling activities, camping holidays, midnight runs, etc. You can get all that in the archives, which are very illuminating on that through diaries and club minutes and club publications. So I mentioned earlier that one of my main arguments is cycling was a political act, consciously or unconsciously. So by the late 60s, early 70s, the bicycle becomes a symbol of the environmental movement, and it was part of. But it was also before that. It was part of the debate and activism regarding the building of cycle paths in the 1930s. As the motor car became more dominant, there was greater concern regarding safety, particularly of children riding a bike, exemplified here in the top left-hand corner by this Ministry of Transport report from 1957. But by the 80s, there was growing activism concerning the rights of cyclists. So we have a cyclist public affairs group leaflet here, which became linked to Friends of the Earth, which became a body which lobbied for better cycling infrastructure from the 1980s, and there's also a campaign, the London Cycling Campaign, set up in London again to lobby for more rights for cyclists, which but it kind of reflects, as you can imagine, the change in debates regarding environmentalism and problems associated with car pollution and congestion, etc. So, and the bicycle came to symbolise, as I said, the environmental movement. Also, as Rachel's mentioned, just briefly, I covered the relationship between cycling and women in the book. I mean, on the left here, this is an image of the Rosslyn Ladies Cycling Club, who were regarded as one of the first, one of the earliest all-female cycling clubs. This is from the 1920s. It's probably shot in the 1930s. And then on the right here is an example of an early sporting body, the Women's Road Records Association. And it reflected the development of women's sport. And during this period, there was a number of female pioneers, such as Margaret Wilson, who rode from John Land's End to John O'Groats. I mean, which was about I think it was about the fourth fastest time, men or women doing it. So there were a number of female pioneers, and she was also a professional cyclist, probably the first one in the sense that she had a contract with a manufacturer. one of the main themes of the book, again, is sport. Just want to quickly show you the contrast between Britain and Europe. So essentially, on the left here, we have Britain, which took a different route initially to Europe, where the focus was on the time trial. That was the main form of road racing, because mass start racing, as you can see here, like the Tour de France, was not legally banned, but it was not. It was very much discouraged in the UK. But this kind of started changing in the interwar period. There's increasing pressures to change, to modernise, and in 1942, the first mass start race took place in Britain. This was largely due to the efforts of this man in the middle, Percy Stallard from Wolverhampton, and his efforts ultimately led to the first de facto tour of Britain in 1947, right into Glasgow, and this was based on the Tour de France. So you can see that kind of the tensions there of these changes in sport were linked to ideas about road safety and etc. Okay, so that's a quick run through some of the themes of the book. Rachel and I kind of thought about potential research projects for other people if they wanted to consider them. And many of these projects or ideas would be buried in the archives. I mean, I think there's from my experience, you could see other projects emerging, but I just didn't have the time or to focus on them. So there was these are just some potential projects. So there's a potentially more economic, industry, business study of the cycling industry. There's kind of special section I noticed in the National Cycle Archive. Cycling subcultures, such as a focus on associational life within the clubs. It could also look at different sports, like some of the minor sports, such as cycle speedway, cyclocross, even workers' sport, in which cycling was a part of. Might be a project, and there's also, as Rachel talked about, in terms of diversity, you'd have to look very hard, I think, to dig into the archives regarding histories of race, gender, LGBTQ plus histories. I mean, lots of these stories are usually hidden in the archives. But again, I think there's the scope there. Or you could do do something more traditional, like institutional history of the governing bodies. I mean, I cover quite a lot of that in the book, but I think there's still scope there to look more deeply at some of the early bodies, such as the National Cycle Archive, the Cyclist Touring Club, or the British League of Racing Cyclists. There's a lot of, like I say, scope for future studies. And cycling and fashion, that's kind of keeps cropping up. I mean, not just women as well. I mean, I think the men should also be featured in any particular studies. And finally, which might be of more interest to this particular kind of seminar, is it's about politics, transport, the politics of transport, and the role of political groups. How that relationship has, how those relationships regarding cycling has shaped wider transport policies. Okay, so that's it. And just a few more archives for you.